Before Tony Curtis died, people remembered him as the dazzling face of old Hollywood. The smile, the charm, the voice that could turn a simple line into a promise. To the world, he was the man who stood beside Marilyn Monroe, Janet Leigh, Natalie Wood, and some of the most unforgettable women of the silver screen. But behind the applause, behind the magazine covers, behind the carefully polished image of a man who seemed to have everything, there was one name that never truly disappeared from his story: Janet Leigh. Not just because she was his first wife, not just because she was the mother of his 2 daughters, not just because they looked perfect together when photographers caught them stepping out of cars, walking into premieres, or smiling under the white flash of Hollywood cameras. Janet was different because she knew Tony before the legend swallowed the man. Before the world called him Tony Curtis, he was still carrying the hunger of a boy from the Bronx. He wanted success so badly that it almost hurt to look at him. He wanted fame. He wanted acceptance. He wanted to walk into rooms where nobody could ignore him anymore. And when Janet came into his life, she did not just fall for the handsome movie star. She saw the ambition, the insecurity, the restless fire underneath. That may have been the beginning of the love story. It may also have been the beginning of the tragedy. In the 1950s, Tony and Janet were not just a couple. They were sold to the public as a dream. Young, beautiful, talented, photogenic. Hollywood loved them because they looked like proof that fairy tales could happen under studio lights. Fans wanted to believe they were happy because their happiness made the whole movie industry feel magical. Every smile looked effortless. Every public appearance looked like a scene from a romance film. Every magazine photo whispered the same message: this is what love looks like when the world is watching. But the world was watching too closely. The more famous they became, the more difficult it was to separate love from performance. A marriage can survive many things, but it struggles when every private wound must be hidden behind a public smile. Janet was expected to be graceful, elegant, steady, and forgiving. Tony was expected to be charming, exciting, unstoppable, and desired by everyone. The image was beautiful. The reality was much heavier. Tony loved admiration. He chased it because he had spent too much of his life feeling invisible. Janet, however, wanted something fame could not provide. She wanted security. She wanted emotional certainty. She wanted a husband who came home as a man, not as a myth. And that was where the cracks began. People often talk about Tony Curtis as a ladies' man, as if that explains everything. But the deeper truth is more complicated. He was not only chasing women, he was chasing confirmation. Every new smile, every new flirtation, every new romance seemed to tell him that he was still wanted, still powerful, still untouchable. Yet the more he chased that feeling, the further he moved from the one woman who had once made him feel seen before he needed the whole world to see him. Janet Leigh was not replaceable, because she represented the version of Tony that existed before the masks became permanent. With her, he had been young enough to dream, but not yet old enough to understand the cost of getting everything he wanted. She had been there during the climb, during the early victories, during the years when their names together seemed stronger than either name alone. Then came the silence that grows between two people who know each other too well. By the time their marriage began falling apart, it was not one single scandal, one single argument, or one single betrayal that destroyed them. It was a slow erosion. 1,000 small disappointments. 1,000 moments where pride spoke louder than tenderness, 1,000 chances to reach for each other that somehow passed. And when Tony Curtis finally moved on, the world assumed he had simply chosen another chapter, another woman, another life, another version of himself. But sometimes a man can leave a marriage and still never escape it. Sometimes the person he replaces is not replaced at all. She just becomes the silent comparison behind every relationship that follows. That is why Janet Leigh remains such a haunting figure in Tony Curtis's life story. Not because their marriage was perfect. It was not. Not because he always treated her as he should have. He did not. But because she belonged to the one period of his life when love and ambition were still tangled together. Before fame hardened him, before regret became part of the legend. In the end, Tony Curtis had many romances, many headlines, many public memories. But the woman he could never truly replace may have been the one who knew him before he learned how to perform being Tony Curtis. And that is where the real story begins. For Tony Curtis, losing Janet Leigh was not just losing a wife. It was losing the one person who had stood beside him when his hunger still looked like hope instead of destruction. That was the part people rarely understood. Hollywood could replace a leading lady overnight. A studio could change posters, rewrite headlines, invent a new romance, and sell the public another dream before the ink was dry. But a private history cannot be recast so easily. Janet had known the unfinished Tony. She had known the man before the legend became too loud. She had seen him in the nervous spaces between confidence and fear, in the moments when he was still trying to convince himself that he belonged among the stars. She had watched the boy from the Bronx become a Hollywood sensation, and she had understood something about him that later women may have only discovered too late. Tony did not simply want to be loved. He wanted to be rescued from the feeling that he was never enough. That kind of emptiness can make a man magnetic. It can also make him impossible to hold. At first, Janet may have believed love could steady him. Maybe she thought marriage, children, and success would calm the restless part of him that kept searching for applause. But fame did not quiet Tony Curtis. It fed him. The bigger he became, the more he needed. Every new role, every new compliment, every new admirer seemed to promise peace. But only for a moment. Then the hunger returned. And Janet, standing beside him, had to watch the man she loved become more available to the world and less available at home. That is the cruel bargain of Hollywood romance. The very qualities that make someone irresistible to millions can make them unreachable to the person closest to them. Tony's charm was not an act, but it was not always a gift either. It could brighten a room, soften a critic, seduce an audience, and make strangers feel chosen. Yet charm does not answer the hard questions in a marriage. Charm does not explain absence. Charm does not heal humiliation. Charm does not sit quietly in the wreckage and say, "I was wrong." Janet Leigh had her own career, her own beauty, her own strength. She was not simply standing in Tony's shadow. But in the story the public wanted, she was often cast as part of his perfect picture. The beautiful wife, the elegant partner, the woman who made the fantasy complete. And maybe that was the trap. The more perfect they looked from the outside, the less room they had to admit what was breaking inside. When the marriage ended, the headlines moved fast. Hollywood always moves fast when a dream collapses. There is shock for a moment, then gossip, then speculation, then a new story to consume. Tony Curtis continued forward. He remarried. He worked. He appeared in public. He kept the machinery of fame alive. To many people, it looked as though he had moved on with the ease of a man who never looked back. But moving on is not the same as being free. The women who came after Janet may have had beauty, glamour, youth, mystery, and excitement. Some gave him passion. Some gave him companionship. Some gave him another chance to feel desired. But none of them could be Janet. Because Janet was not just a woman in his past. She was the witness to the beginning. She had been there before the damage became polished. Before the public version of Tony Curtis became so strong that even Tony himself could hide behind it. She remembered the raw ambition, the vulnerability, the desperate need to prove something to everyone who had ever doubted him. That memory made her irreplaceable. Not because their marriage survived. It did not. But because she carried the truth of who he had been before Hollywood taught him how to dazzle and disappear. And perhaps that is why her absence remained so powerful. A man can surround himself with people and still be haunted by the one person who saw him clearly. He can fill his calendar, his home, his life, and still feel the silence left by someone who once knew the sound of his real voice. Tony Curtis spent much of his life in motion. New films, new relationships, new reinventions. But the first great love has a way of staying still, like a photograph that refuses to fade. Janet represented a road he could never walk again. A younger life, a family before fracture, a love story before the bitterness, a time when the dream still seemed possible. That may be why the idea of the one woman he could never replace feels so painful. It was not only about romance. It was about regret. It was about a man looking back and realizing that some people do not leave because they stop mattering. They leave because they mattered too much. And the person who should have protected the love did not know how until it was already gone. For Tony Curtis, Janet Leigh was not the woman who failed to stay. She was the woman he failed to keep. The strange thing about regret is that it does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it does not come as a confession, a public apology, or a dramatic scene where everything is finally understood. Sometimes regret lives quietly, inside the way a man says a name, in the way his eyes shift when an old photograph appears, in the way he laughs too quickly when someone mentions the past, as if laughter can cover the wound before anyone notices it is still open. For Tony Curtis, Janet Leigh was that kind of wound. She was not simply part of his biography. She was part of the emotional architecture of his life. Long after the marriage ended, long after the public stopped seeing them as husband and wife, long after both of them continued their separate paths, their story remained attached to his legend. People could talk about his movies, his beauty, his charisma, his scandals, his later marriages, but sooner or later, the name Janet Leigh always returned. Because she was the chapter that made the rest of the book harder to understand. If Tony had truly been only a reckless romantic, then replacing her would have been easy. If he had simply wanted glamour, Hollywood had no shortage of glamorous women. If he had only wanted attention, the world was more than willing to give it to him. But Janet represented something deeper than attraction. She represented the life he might have had if he had been less afraid of ordinary happiness. That is the heartbreaking part. Some men are not ruined because they lack love. They are ruined because they do not know how to live inside love once they receive it. Tony had the wife. He had the children. He had the home. He had the career. From a distance, it looked as though he had won the entire game. But inside that victory, there was still a restless boy waiting for someone to tell him he was enough. And no matter how much Janet gave, she could not fill a hole Tony did not yet know how to close. So the marriage became a mirror. Janet showed him what stability looked like, what loyalty looked like, what family could have become. But mirrors can be cruel when a person does not like what they see. Instead of becoming softer inside that love, Tony often seemed to run from it. He ran toward applause, toward temptation, toward roles and rooms and people who asked less of him emotionally. Because admiration is easier than intimacy. Admiration only asks you to shine. Intimacy asks you to be honest. And honesty was not easy for a man who had spent his life constructing an image. Tony Curtis had learned early that reinvention could be survival. He had changed his name. He had changed his world. He had built himself into a star almost by force of will. But a man who reinvents himself too many times can become terrified of being known completely. Janet knew too much. She knew the anxious parts, the hungry parts, the parts that did not fit into the handsome poster on the wall. And that may have made her love both precious and dangerous to him. Because to be loved by someone who truly sees you is beautiful only if you are ready to stop hiding. Tony was not ready. That is why the women who came later could never occupy the same place. They could know the famous Tony, the charming Tony, the difficult Tony, the aging Tony, the Tony who wanted to prove he was still desired. But Janet had known the original wound. She had been there at the beginning of the transformation, close enough to understand what fame had given him and what it had stolen. When their daughters grew up, the story became even more complicated. A marriage can end, but parenthood keeps the past alive. Every child carries pieces of the love that created them, even when that love no longer survives. Through Kelly and Jamie, Tony and Janet remained connected in a way no divorce paper could erase. Their family history became a living reminder of what had once been possible. And for Tony, that may have made Janet impossible to forget. Not because he spent every day openly longing for her. Life rarely works that neatly. He moved forward, built new relationships, made new mistakes, chased new versions of himself. But certain people remain inside a life like background music. You do not hear them every second, but when the room gets quiet, they are still there. Janet Leigh was still there. She was there in the contrast between the fairy tale image and the painful truth. She was there in the question people kept asking without always saying it aloud. How could a man have something that beautiful and still lose it? She was there in the way Tony's later romances seemed to circle the same emptiness without ever fully solving it. She was there as proof that being loved by the right woman does not save a man who has not yet learned how to save himself. And maybe, near the end, that was the truth Tony could no longer outrun. He could look back at a life full of fame, beauty, pleasure, and applause, and still understand that some losses do not announce themselves as losses when they happen. At first, they feel like freedom. Later, they feel like silence. Janet Leigh was not the woman Tony Curtis simply left behind. She was the woman time kept bringing back. As the years passed, Tony Curtis became a man surrounded by memories that refused to stay in order. Some memories came polished, like scenes from a film. Red carpets, studio lights, laughter from beautiful rooms, the thrill of hearing his name spoken with admiration. But other memories arrived differently. They came with the weight of unfinished conversations. They came with the faces of people he had hurt. They came with the quiet understanding that fame can give a man the world while quietly taking away the one home he should have protected. Janet Leigh belonged to that second kind of memory. She was not only a woman from his past. She was the proof that Tony had once stood at the edge of a different life. A life where love might have been enough. A life where the family he built could have become stronger than the attention he chased. A life where the applause outside the door did not matter more than the voice waiting for him inside the house. But Tony Curtis was not built for stillness. Stillness asks a man to face himself. It asks him to sit with the discomfort, the insecurity, the fear that no camera can soften and no audience can erase. Tony had spent so long turning himself into someone unforgettable that ordinary peace may have felt almost threatening. A calm marriage, a faithful home, a stable love. These things sound beautiful to someone looking from the outside. But to a man addicted to proving his own worth, peace can feel like silence, and silence can feel like rejection. That was the tragedy inside him. He wanted love, but he also wanted escape. He wanted family, but he also wanted freedom. He wanted to be adored, but when someone loved him closely enough to see his flaws, that closeness may have felt too dangerous. Janet did not love an illusion. She loved a man. And for Tony, being loved as a man may have been harder than being adored as a star. Because a star can always perform. A husband cannot. A father cannot. A man standing in the ruins of his own choices cannot. After the marriage ended, the public story became simple. Tony and Janet were over. Hollywood moved on. New headlines arrived. New marriages followed. New chapters were written. But the emotional truth was never that clean. Janet remained tied to the most human part of his story because she had seen both the beauty and the damage before anyone else fully understood what fame was doing to him. That is what made her impossible to replace. Other women could enter his life after the fact. They could meet Tony Curtis, the movie star. Tony Curtis, the charming rebel. Tony Curtis, the complicated older man. Tony Curtis, the legend with a past that everyone wanted to touch. But Janet had known him when the legend was still being made. She had watched the armor go on piece by piece. She had seen the transformation up close enough to know that the shine came with pain. And perhaps that is why her memory had such power. A man may forget compliments. He may forget parties. He may forget the names of people who once made him feel important for a single evening. But he does not forget the person who knew the difference between his confidence and his fear. He does not forget the woman who looked at him before the world looked at him and saw not a product, not a fantasy, not a headline, but a wounded, ambitious, difficult, magnetic man who wanted to be loved and did not know how to receive it. Janet knew that Tony's charm could open doors, but she also knew charm could close a heart. She knew his smile could make strangers trust him, but she also knew the smile could appear when he was avoiding the truth. She knew the beauty of him. She also knew the cost of staying close to him. That kind of knowledge cannot be replaced by attraction. It cannot be replaced by youth. It cannot be replaced by another wedding, another romance, another public performance of happiness. The person who knows your beginning holds a power that no one else can copy. And that power becomes even stronger when the ending was never truly resolved. Maybe Tony Curtis understood this more clearly as he got older. In youth, a man often mistakes movement for progress. He thinks the next relationship will fix what the last one exposed. He thinks desire means healing. He thinks reinvention means freedom. But age has a cruel honesty. It strips away the glamour around old decisions and leaves only the question underneath. What did I lose because I did not know how to stay? For Tony, Janet was part of that question. She represented the woman he could not keep, the family that fractured, the love story that became a warning instead of a fairy tale. And in the twilight of his life, when the cameras were less forgiving and the applause was farther away, perhaps the truth became impossible to ignore. The greatest loss was not always the most dramatic one. Sometimes it was the one that happened slowly, while everyone else was still smiling for the photograph. Tony Curtis could replace the image. He could not replace the witness. And Janet Leigh had witnessed the man before the myth swallowed him whole. The public loved to remember Tony Curtis as a man who lived in color. Fast cars, beautiful women, expensive suits, famous friends, bright parties, sharp jokes. A face made for close-ups, and a personality too big to stay quietly in any room. But the closer a man gets to the end of his life, the less those colors matter. What remains are not always the loudest memories. What remains are the ones that still ask questions. For Tony, Janet Leigh may have been the question that never stopped asking. What if he had stayed? What if he had listened? What if he had understood earlier that love is not something a man keeps by being admired, but by being present? Those questions are painful because they do not change anything. They only reveal what was once possible. Janet had offered Tony something fame could not manufacture. She had offered him a real place in another person's heart, not because he was Tony Curtis the star, but because he was the man she had chosen when the future still felt open. That kind of love is rare. It comes before the cynicism, before the disappointments, before the world teaches both people how to protect themselves. When that kind of love breaks, it does not disappear cleanly. It becomes part of everything that follows. Tony's later life was full of new beginnings, but new beginnings can sometimes be disguises for old endings. Each relationship gave him a chance to become someone else, or at least to believe he could. But the shadow of Janet was different because she belonged to the foundation. She was not added to his life after he became a legend. She was there while the legend was still under construction. That made her dangerous to his memory. Because Janet did not simply remind him of love. She reminded him of accountability. She reminded him of the children, the promises, the private rooms where nobody was clapping. She reminded him of a version of success that did not depend on applause. And perhaps that was the version he had not been brave enough to choose. There is a difference between wanting a woman and honoring her. Tony may have wanted many women in his life. He may have desired them, pursued them, admired them, celebrated them. But Janet required something deeper than desire. She required maturity. She required consistency. She required a man who could remain when the excitement faded and the responsibilities became real. That was where Tony struggled. Not because he was incapable of feeling. In many ways, he felt too much. He carried old wounds, old insecurities, old hunger from a childhood that had not given him enough gentleness. But feeling deeply is not the same as loving well. A man can feel sorrow and still cause pain. He can feel longing and still run away. He can feel regret and still fail to become the person he should have been when it mattered most. This is why Janet Leigh's place in his story feels so tragic. She was not a villain. She was not merely a victim. She was not just another glamorous Hollywood wife whose name belonged beside his in old photographs. She was the woman who stood at the crossroads of Tony's life. On one side was the home he could have built. On the other side was the endless chase for validation. Tony chose the chase, and the chase never truly ended. That is the hidden cost of becoming a legend. Everyone remembers the image, but the image does not hold you at night. Everyone remembers the charm. But charm does not forgive you when you finally understand the damage you caused. Everyone remembers the success, but success cannot walk backward through time and repair the moment you let the wrong person slip away. And Janet had slipped away. Not in one dramatic scene, not in a single door slammed forever, but slowly, painfully, as the space between them filled with things neither of them could fully repair. Public smiles became easier than private honesty. Appearances became easier than confession. Pride became easier than apology. And by the time the marriage ended, the love story had already been wounded beyond the point where nostalgia could save it. Still, nostalgia has power. It can make a man revisit the past not as it was, but as it might have been. It can turn an old marriage into a room he enters again and again in memory. He sees the young Janet. He sees the beginning. He sees the family. He sees himself before the choices hardened into consequences. And maybe, in that room, he understands what the world never fully saw. The woman he could never replace was not perfect, because no one is perfect. Their marriage was not simple, because real marriages never are. But Janet Leigh remained unforgettable, because she represented the one thing Tony Curtis could not buy, perform, charm, or reinvent. She represented the life that might have saved him from himself. And perhaps that is why, even after all the fame, all the women, all the applause, and all the years, her name still carried a different weight. Other women could be part of Tony Curtis's legend. Janet Leigh was part of his truth. By the time Tony Curtis became an older man, the world had changed around him. The studio system that built him was gone. The kind of fame that once made him untouchable had turned into memory. Younger audiences knew pieces of him, fragments of a legend. The handsome face from old films, the funny man in Some Like It Hot, the charming rebel who had once seemed too alive to ever become old. But age comes for every star. It softens the spotlight. It makes the applause sound farther away. And when the noise fades, a man is left with the people he loved, the people he lost, and the people he can never explain away. For Tony, Janet Leigh remained in that final category. She was not a scandal he could laugh off. She was not a fling that belonged to one wild chapter. She was not just a name in a list of romances. She was the woman who had once shared his home, his children, his public dream, and his private unraveling. She had seen the rise from inside the room. She had seen the cost before the rest of the world understood there was a cost at all. And that kind of woman never truly disappears. When people looked back at Tony and Janet, they often saw the photographs first. The beautiful young couple. The kind of Hollywood pairing that seemed almost designed by fate. He was dark-haired, electric, confident, hungry. She was elegant, radiant, composed, with a kind of grace that made the camera trust her. Together, they looked like everything the public wanted to believe about love in the 1950s. They looked like glamour could become a marriage. They looked like success could protect tenderness. They looked like two people who had found the dream before the dream could disappoint them. But photographs are merciful liars. They freeze the second before the argument. They preserve the smile, but not the silence afterward. They show the dress, the suit, the perfect angle, but they do not show the loneliness building behind closed doors. They do not show a woman waiting for emotional honesty from a man who knew how to perform everything except vulnerability. They do not show a man adored by millions who still could not believe love would stay unless he kept proving he was desirable. That was Tony's curse. He had spent his life escaping the feeling of being unwanted. Fame became his weapon against that old pain. Women became mirrors that reflected back the version of himself he needed to see. Applause became medicine. But medicine taken for the wrong wound eventually becomes poison. The more the world confirmed his charm, the less he seemed able to rest inside one steady love. Janet may have understood that before anyone else. She may have seen that Tony's betrayals, his restlessness, his hunger for attention were not simply arrogance. They were symptoms of something deeper. But understanding a wound does not mean you can live beside it forever. A woman can have compassion and still be hurt. She can see the damaged child inside the man and still refuse to keep paying the price for his damage. That is why her leaving mattered. It forced the fantasy to break. For the public, the end of the marriage was another Hollywood divorce. Sad, dramatic, disappointing, but not unfamiliar. For Tony, it may have been something more unsettling. It was proof that charm had limits. It was proof that even the woman who once knew him most deeply could reach a point where love was not enough to survive the pain surrounding it. And when Janet walked out of the role the world had written for her, she became even harder to replace. Because she did something no later romance could undo. She proved that she was not just part of Tony's image. She was a person with her own dignity, her own breaking point, her own life beyond his shadow. That may have made the loss sharper over time. It is one thing to lose someone because passion fades. It is another to lose someone because your own choices made staying impossible. Tony Curtis lived long enough to see his story become legend. But legends often hide the most ordinary human truths. A man can be famous and still lonely. He can be desired and still insecure. He can have many women and still be haunted by one. He can spend decades trying to rewrite himself, only to discover that the first chapters remain the strongest. Janet Leigh was one of those chapters. Not because she completed him. No woman could have done that. Not because their marriage was flawless. It was not. But because she stood at the place where love, ambition, family, and fame collided. She was the witness to his becoming and the casualty of what he became. And maybe that is the real reason he could never replace her. A man can find another lover. He can find another wife. He can find another person to stand beside him in photographs. But he cannot find another beginning. He cannot return to the moment before pride hardened, before trust cracked, before love became something remembered instead of protected. Tony could keep living. He could keep smiling. He could keep telling stories from the old days. But somewhere behind all of it, Janet Leigh remained the woman who knew the truth before the legend learned how to hide it. Near the end of a life as public as Tony Curtis's, people begin to search for the final meaning. They look through the films, the interviews, the marriages, the family wounds, the old photographs, and they try to decide what the story was really about. Was it about fame? Was it about beauty? Was it about talent? Was it about a poor boy who fought his way into Hollywood and became unforgettable? Or was it about something more painful than that? Maybe Tony Curtis's story was about a man who won the world before he learned how to keep what mattered. And that is why Janet Leigh remains so central to the emotional truth of his life. She was there at the point where everything could still have gone another way. Before the later marriages, before the harder regrets, before the public began to see him as a man of many romances instead of one great love that had slipped through his hands. Janet stood at the beginning of the myth, but she also stood at the beginning of the damage. The world saw her as beautiful. Tony may have seen something more dangerous. He may have seen a woman who made him feel known, not admired from a distance, not desired through a screen. Known. And for a man like Tony, being known was both a dream and a threat. Because when someone knows you, they can see when the smile is hiding panic. They can see when the confidence is borrowed. They can see when the charm is no longer generosity, but defense. Janet could see the boy behind the star, and that made her love more powerful than applause. It also made it harder for Tony to escape the truth when he disappointed her. That is what many people misunderstand about irreplaceable women. They are not always the easiest love. They are not always the most peaceful chapter. They are not always the person a man treats best, because sometimes a man hurts the person whose love exposes him most. Janet Leigh may have been irreplaceable precisely because she was not just part of Tony's pleasure. She was part of his conscience. She reminded him of promises. She reminded him of children. She reminded him of the version of himself that had once wanted more than attention. That kind of reminder can haunt a man long after the marriage certificate is gone. Tony Curtis could build a life full of movement, but Janet represented stillness. She represented the home he could not outrun, the family portrait that never stopped existing even after it broke, the private history that no new romance could erase. Every later love arrived after the fall. Janet belonged to the time before it. That is why she occupied a place no one else could reach. And perhaps, with age, Tony understood that more clearly. When a man is young, he often thinks life is endless. He believes there will always be another chance, another woman, another apology, another beginning. He believes the future will excuse the damage done in the present. But the future does not always forgive. Sometimes it only reveals the shape of what was lost. Tony could look back and see that he had not simply lost Janet as a wife. He had lost the shared innocence of their beginning. He had lost the belief that love and fame could grow together without one destroying the other. He had lost the trust of a woman who once stood beside him when he was not yet the complete legend the world would later remember. And once that kind of trust is broken, it cannot be replaced by admiration. It cannot be replaced by another beautiful face. It cannot be replaced by the applause of strangers. This is why the title of the story feels so heavy. Before he died, Tony Curtis admitted the one woman he could never replace. Whether said directly or revealed through the pattern of his life, the meaning is the same. Janet Leigh was not replaceable because she was not merely a lover. She was the beginning, the witness, the mirror, and the wound. She was the woman who knew him before fame gave him 1,000 ways to hide. In the end, that may be the loneliest part of Tony Curtis's life. He had been adored by audiences across the world, but the love he could not replace was the one that had asked him to be real. Not dazzling, not perfect, not endlessly charming, real. And perhaps that was the one role he never fully mastered. Tony Curtis could become a pirate, a soldier, a millionaire, a comic genius, a romantic lead. He could wear costumes, change voices, steal scenes, and make millions believe whatever the script required. But when the cameras stopped, when the house was quiet, when the past returned without makeup or music, there was one truth no performance could soften. Janet Leigh had once loved the man behind the legend, and he had not known how to protect that love until it had already become memory.